Hi guys, welcome or welcome back. Today I want to walk you through the books I read during the month of September. I read quite a lot, and that means I also have still to catch up on telling you about the books I read because I didn't film any videos in September. So I have already filmed a video where I talk casually about the 3 audiobooks I read during that month. But I'm going to focus on this video, I'm going to focus on the physical books that I read. And we're going to jump in because I have quite a lot to get through. And the first one is one that I've anticipated reading for such a long time. And I read it together with Laurent from the channel Reading with Macar, which you should all be subscribed to because if you like the kind of videos I make, you'll probably like her videos as well. And she's such a wonderful person, and we read The 13th Tale by Diane Setterfield together, which was such a blast. In general, I think it's a book many book lovers will probably like, and especially if you like books with a Gothic feel, because this is very much what it was. It felt like a modern day Gothic novel, and I thought it was also really interesting that the author, in her writing, she was kind of partly emulating the way sentences were structured or the words used. So it really plunged you into this old-timey Gothic feel. And basically, I think it's also a book that really profits from not knowing too much about it. So I'm just going to say that it's a book that is about a woman writer called Vida Winter. She is getting quite old and knows she will probably die soon. So she contracts a woman called Margaret Lee to essentially write her story. And that is pretty special because Vita Winter, during her whole writing career, has built up this set of crazy stories that she tells journalists whenever they want to know more about her personal story and her background. So there's definitely a lot of anticipation, both by the public and Margaret Lee as well, to finally understand what this woman's story is. And it's one hell of a ride of a story, and it definitely kept me on my toes. It's very atmospheric, you really breeze through this book, and it's also kind of a love story to telling stories in general and like the power of a story. Objectively, this book has some parts where the plotting is really messy, but somehow I was so engrossed in it that I thought, I just want to see what happens. It's definitely not a perfect book, but subjectively it's such an amazing book, and it will make you turn the pages, and it's so engrossing. And if you've ever thought about picking it up, I hope I convinced you, because I'm annoyed myself that I took so long to finally get to it. The second book I read in September is maybe a more obscure one. It's from the author Marie Hart, who comes from my home region, Alsace. And I want to read everything that she's written at some point, and I've already talked about her book that was partly memoir about her time in Alsace just after the First World War. And this is kind of some snippets of short stories of kind of memories and stories she remembers from her childhood growing up in a rural area in Alsace before the Franco-Prussian War, so before 1870. And it was just a really lovely book. She has a very nostalgic way of writing, and I noticed that in her other book already, but this was very nostalgic again, and it made me a bit homesick. There's some wonderful description of what her Christmas was like. There's also some really funny story about when she got her first crinoline, which I guess really fits in the 1860s, and you can imagine her wearing this thing and like it not really being compatible with a young girl playing outside. So that was really, really funny to read about. There were also some stories that were more serious, and they tackle topics that I'm personally really interested in because it's a really important part of the history of Alsace. And it deals with just this relationship between France and Germany and how Alsace is really stuck in a tug of war between these two countries, and how culturally it's very difficult to define where it sits. And so there's a story about some of her cousins which came from Germany, from Swabia, and how there is a culture clash there, but also there being culture clashes from people from Paris coming to Alsace. And it was just really, really interesting, which I knew it would be, and it was just really, really lovely. I mean, you can read it if you know how to speak German. I am not sure there's a French translation for that one, but yeah, as I said, it's a really more of an obscure one, but you know, it's stuff that I'm interested in, and I think it's also really interesting from a historical standpoint, and it's important to me personally, so I thought I would share it. Next up, I needed a bit of fast reads that were fun and quick. And I have already talked about me rereading or having started rereading the Nancy Drew series. I did that earlier this year, and it wasn't always a positive experience, unfortunately, because I felt like they didn't really age well. And there were some of these things about like women's bodies and like, you can imagine, like typically from the 1950s. And I was kind of disappointed that I didn't like the books as much as I remembered to like them. So I was kind of treading cautiously when I was back home at my parents' and picked up a book that I remember reading as a young kid and really liking. And it's from an author from Brittany, from Bretagne, called Evelyne Brisou-Pellen. And she has written a lot for kids. I'm not aware that has been translated, but I will look it up, and if she was, then I will link it down below. But she writes these books. A lot of her books are set in the 15th century. And I had only 2 of them at my parents' house, although I'm pretty sure I read a lot more, so probably they were from the library. So I picked up one which is a kind of standalone, and it's called Le fantôme de Maître Guillemain, the ghost of Master Guillemain. And this is set in 1481 in Nantes University. And we follow this young man called Martin. He's only 12 years old, and he was brought up in a convent because he was an orphan. And he is admitted at the university in Nantes. And the first thing I have to say is that, firstly, this book is so incredibly well researched from the historical standpoint. There are so many interesting tidbits of how universities worked in that time. There's a map of the medieval city of Nantes. How was the university structured? How were the courses? How did the monks kind of intersect with the worldly professors? And all these things which were so interesting. And just, passing by next to the story, which really, really positively surprised me. And I now really understand why I'm so fascinated by that time in history, and that probably comes from these books. Because there's so much of like world building, like in terms of really describing historical facts, which I really like, down to like some clothing stuff when the character puts on their clothes, and it makes a lot of sense. That's what people used to wear. And that was just so lovely to see. But just in brief, the plot is Martin goes to the university, and there is a fellow student who is murdered. And there's, obviously some rumors from the other students that the founder of the university has something against specific students, and that his ghost is kind of killing the student. The situation gets worse because there's one murder, but then there's another murder, and it gets more and more difficult for the university to kind of hush it up within the city. And that's another thing that was also really interesting. I mean, you might know that up until a certain point, university had their own judicial system. So if a student in university wouldn't have been necessarily, at least within the walls of the university, would not be submitted on the same laws as a normal citizen. And so this is also really very much incorporated in that. So I was so impressed, and that made me want to read some of her other books. And I kind of ordered some secondhand books from her, and more specifically from a series she's written, which follows another character. And I read, I think, book 2 from that series. I think there's almost more than 12 or something. I probably haven't read all of them as a kid, but I really want to revisit them now because I'm so happy I found a childhood series that really lives up to the memories I have of it and that I can still get something from as an adult, which is so cool. The series I'm talking about is Garin Troussebeuf. Garin is the main character in the whole series, and he is a young man who kind of fled his home because he was living in extreme poverty. I think he says that like he has like 12 other siblings, and his father beat him. So he essentially flees, and he is essentially a young scribe, so he knows how to read and to write, and that's, you know, definitely not something everyone could at that time. So he is basically roaming around France. Mostly, I think he starts in Bretagne, and this also very much plays in Bretagne. And he is basically going and proposing services to whoever he finds to write wills or whatever people need to have written down. In this story, he is forced to go to a small village because he is basically snowed in, and there's a lot of paranoia in this village about the wolves getting always closer to the village and closer than they usually do. So people are very scared that the wolves will dare and come to the village. And in the backdrop, he is taken in by this young girl who lives alone in a big house with her 2 smaller siblings, and he learns that her father went away on a pilgrimage to Rome and basically left them alone. Garin then discovers that a lot of people in the village mistrust the young girl, Jordan, because they think she's a witch. They think she's a witch and that she controls the wolves. So you can imagine how it goes on from there. And what I love about this book is that it really woves in a lot, I think, of pretty much historically accurate thoughts about, you know, what is being other, how it is to be isolated. The big scare of wolves in general and all the mythology around werewolves, loups-garous, which was really, really fascinating. So I also had a lot of fun with that one. And finally, the big one, the one book that I read together with a bunch of other people as a read-along. And it was so much fun. Thank you again for all the people who've participated in the discussions. It just was so, so cool. And I really hope to do it again soon with another book by Émile Zola. And that is Germinal. At last I read this book that is called, by so many people, Zola's masterpiece, and that I was kind of dreading getting into, but it didn't disappoint. So this follows Etienne Lantier, who is a young man. I think he's 18 when we start following him. And he's been fired from his previous job in a factory because he was being violent to his boss. And he is in the north of France and starts working in a mine there. And he very quickly sees how the working conditions are. And I mean, if you know Zola's style and the literary movement he wrote part of, he does not shy away from the detail and from the horridness of the living and working condition of these workers, getting down in the mines from the age of like 8 and basically living there all their lives with all the physical harm that comes with it, the long-term physical harm. And it's essentially about how these workers with the help of Etienne, want to go on a strike and all the fallout that comes from that. And we follow, typically with Zola books, and it's often like this, it's a whole tapestry of people. We follow Etienne, but we also follow a family of miners, les Maheu, and their family of like 10 or 11 people, the grandfather and the kids and the parents, and how their lives are. And there's a lot about women and their condition in these living conditions as well. And we also have some interesting tidbits about people who run these mining communities, in which circumstances they live and how they profit from this very hard labor. I don't know, there's just so much to unpack in this book. It's ultimately a lot about just the human condition and wanting something better from your life and deciding for yourself to which point are you ready to get that and how much sacrifices are you willing to make. And it was just really engrossing and heart-wrenching up until the end. I mean, if you read Zola, probably any of his books, don't expect to have all the people you like still be alive by the end. But he uses that very much to highlight and to put things that he wants to show to the world, the horrible stuff that was happening in the 19th century in France, to really put it in front of the reader's face and see this is the harsh reality and this is how it happens. And it just never ceases to amaze me. So yeah, I really, really enjoyed it. I probably enjoyed it even more reading it together with other people. And it's definitely a good starting point if you want to start with Zola. It's a book where I don't feel like I can do really a in-depth themes review with like a lot of information. I feel it's like a very visceral response and a very emotional response to this book. So yeah, I guess that's all you're getting. But read it. If you're interested in it, read it, because it's so worth it. Alright guys, these were all the books that I read in September that I hadn't talked to you about before. It's probably going to be a longer video than usual, but I hope you got some recommendations and you thought it interesting. Let me know what you've been reading during the month of September, what you're reading right now. Are you reading anything cool that you want to recommend me? Would love to know that. And yeah, I hope you're doing well. And until next time, I'll see you. Bye.